Okay, so today we'll be going on to Unit 4, but just before that we'll be finishing up what we didn't really mention in Unit 3, so we'll be expanding more on the Federalist Era, or the predecessor to the First Party Era. So I'm going to go next. Okay, so here's just a quick review. During the founding era, towards the end of the founding era, there became these two kind of groups. We can call them groups. They weren't parties yet, but they were groups split between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. And we reviewed basically of some key ideals or like key characteristics of many Federalists and Anti-Federalists. One important one was that many Federalists favored a ratification of the Constitution. So they really liked the Constitution, and they said, a Bill of Rights was not needed because, the federal power was limited enough, and that we could share the power between state and federal government. Anti-Federalists, they didn't really like the Constitution. They said, we want a Bill of Rights. We want stronger power. We want more power to the people and more power to limited, local governments. Rather than a big, strong government, because they were scared that, with this new nation or this new country, they were scared that a strong federal government would lead to, again, a monarchy, or what they experienced in Britain. So they really wanted, something that's in the middle. They wanted a, limited state government like they had before. But what ended up happening is the Constitution did get ratified, and the Bill of Rights was included, and there were 10 amendments drafted by James Madison to the Constitution that became the U.S. Bill of Rights. So there was kind of this middle ground between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. After this, we talked a little bit about the Federalist Era. So the Federalist Era was, basically what it, self-explanatory. It was an era between 1789 to 1800 that was dominated by people that were Federalist. Their key events happened in one, they won the ratification for the Constitution, so which, is a prominent win for the Federalists, for many Federalists. And two, George Washington, who was the first president at that time, was very sympathetic to the Federalist program. He passed many of the major policies, major legislative battles. So, the Federalists were winning in, in Congress, or in number of representatives in the federal government. And we're also going to talk a little about the Jay's Treaty, which also increased Federalist power and showcased another major legislative battle that Federalists actually won. And we also talked about the national bank debate. So the national bank was actually implemented. So that's really good because Alexander Hamilton, he was a Federalist. He believed the national bank was key, so Congress can have power over certain states to levy taxes or control some form of the economy for states. So that was another win. A lot of his financial programs and the national bank was actually implemented as part of the U.S. government. So that's another win for the Federalist Era, and that's why this era of 11 years is called the Federalist Era. So we're talking a little bit more about the Jay's Treaty. So the Jay's Treaty was a treaty in reaction to a couple events. The first event was, after the Revolutionary War, Britain was supposed to evacuate their forts and their settlements alongside the Northwest Territory, but they didn't. So many Americans, or many Americans, or like previous colonists, they felt that, that was very immoral, and then they should have followed, or they should have kept to their word. And two, there was this kind of conspiracy that Americans thought that the British were conspiring with Native American tribes to attack much of the land settlement alongside the Northwest Territory. So we have one, they wouldn't evacuate their forts, and two, they thought they were conspiring with natives, and three, many British naval ships seized over around 200 or 250 plus American ships. So the Americans were already angry over these three things. So Chief Justice John Jay proposed a treaty the treaty mentioned these a lot of points, but these are like the most important points. To evacuate the Northwest Territory, and the U.S. would have to pay the debt owed by British merchants, so that British naval ships would stop seizing American ships, and um, Britain refused, or Britain didn't have to pay these southern planters. And a couple things happened because of this treaty. One, it exacerbated the tensions between the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists, because as we mentioned before, the Anti-Federalists, and Federalists had different, kind of like reasons, or different different reasons, or why they want to, or different reasons, or different like goals to see which country they want to like form like a relationship with. So this Jay's Treaty really strained the relationship between France, and many of the Federalists didn't really like that, because the Federalists, or the Anti-Federalists didn't really like that because they wanted a good relationship with France. The Federalists wanted a really good relationship with Britain. So this caused France to be really angry at much of the American states or colonies, because they felt that, or their states now, because they felt that they were siding with Great Britain, despite the fact that France gave a lot of materials and gave a lot of supplies for them to win the American Revolution. And the treaty also forced Southern planters to pay off debt, while New England merchants collected money for the damaged ships. So the Southern planters were forced to pay debt, while New England merchants, they kind of benefited from it because they gained money in the process. So after the Jay's Treaty, we have what is called the First Party Era. So we mentioned before we had previously Alexander Hamilton versus Thomas Jefferson, and we put them into two groups. We put Alexander Hamilton in the Federalist group and Thomas Jefferson in the Anti-Federalist group. So the Jay's Treaty, so after the Jay's Treaty, the Anti-Federalists dropped the name Anti-Federalist. They went on to call themselves Democratic Republicans, because they felt that they wanted a weak central government plus a stricter interpretation of the Constitution. So much of the ideals, or like the ideas that the Anti-Federalists believed in, the Democratic Republicans adopted. And Thomas Jefferson was both a key figure for both kind of like parties, and these two were the kind of the first official parties. So the Federalists was one party, and Democratic Republicans were another party. So right now, like, we have other parties like the Democrats and the Republicans, but during this time it was the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. And you can read that the Federalists wanted the same thing as before: a strong central government plus a loose interpretation of the Constitution. They wanted a national bank, protect tariffs, a good relationship with Britain. Democratic Republicans wanted a weak central government, a stricter interpretation of the Constitution, and they wanted a relationship with France. Okay, so after George Washington's presidency, after he stepped down to be president, John Adams became the second president. So his presidency was kind of marked by two key events. One was a quasi-war with France. So quasi-war basically means a war that is undeclared. So it was a war with France because it was war with France, but it was undeclared. So it wasn't an official war. It was kind of like several disputes over, over water, or over like the areas of trade, or like several naval disputes. And reasons why: because the French really resented the Jay Treaty. They thought that America was backing up Great Britain again, despite the fact that, as I mentioned before, they supported them during the American Revolution, so they kind of felt like betrayed. So France seized 300 plus American ships during this time, and it was just this ongoing battle. John Adams didn't really want to start a war, especially since it wasn't that long after the American Revolution. And then France also, who was ruled by like Napoleon during this time. Napoleon also wanted to focus on Britain instead of America. So it's kind of like this undeclared war, just like mini battles and disputes. And during this time of the quasi-war with France, John Adams passed the Alien and Sedition Act. he passed the Alien Sedition Act after the war. The Alien Sedition Acts were basically to punish the Democratic Republicans, because the Democratic Republicans did not support the Democratic Republicans kind of really wanted they really wanted a war with France, or like they wanted like some conflict, right? And the Democratic Republicans, you know, were also a key component of the Jay's Treaty, since there was like accelerated tensions. So the Alien Sedition Acts allow for censorship and allowed the president to deport undesirables out of the country. So much of the censorship that happened was, you know, it was illegal during this time. It was illegal to, you know, write anything bad about the president. It was illegal to say anything bad about the president, to just do anything or any action that would, you know, that would paint the president in a bad light. And with the Alien Sedition Acts, there was also the passing of the Naturalization Act, which is really important because it was a step forward to like citizenship, or how like people or immigrants can get citizenship. So instead of the 5 years, instead of staying for United States for 5 years, people or immigrants have to stay in the United States for 14 years in order to get citizenship. So this is kind of like this first time where, you know, obtain like, or a path to obtain citizenship was kind of declared in America. So that's John Adams. Second, we have the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, which was a reaction to the Alien Sedition Act, because many thought the Alien and Sedition Acts were unconstitutional, especially since we passed the Bill of Rights, you know, the First Amendment, which says we should have freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of press, right? So Thomas Jefferson and James Madison supported the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, and the kind of thing that happened was everyone decided, well, Kentucky and Virginia and James Madison, Thomas Jefferson kind of decided that the states had a power to nullify a law. And the word nullify basically means to, you know, deem a law like, or like they don't have to follow the law if states thought it was unconstitutional, or the states thought it was wrong. So it's also like this first time we see disputes between federal government and state government, and we'll see much of that later alongside American history, especially in period 4 and 5. Okay, so now we're going to move on to period 4, which is around 48 to 50 years between 1800 and 1848. First thing that happened was the Thomas Jefferson and his presidency. So after George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson became the third president through the Revolution of 1800. While it's called a revolution, the election of 1800 was basically a smooth transition of power for the first time that happened in America, and like in many other countries, a smooth transition of power from the Federalist rule to the Democratic Republican rule. So we see for the first time a new like a much better, I guess, like a change in political parties with that is smooth, and there was like no conflict involved. And obviously, if you compare this to Great Britain, and you know, and their revolutions and the Glorious Revolution, where, you know, much shifts in power, like transitions in power, were caused by violence and conflict. This is something really different, something really unique to America. So Thomas Jefferson emphasized a few different things. They all fall under the category of Jeffersonian democracy. So Thomas Jefferson was was really big on, you know, having a really good agrarian republic. So he emphasized farmers, the yeoman farmers. So it's like regular farmers, you know, who just lived their life farming and, you know, obtaining money through manual labor and crops. He thought that many New Englanders, or people that were, you know, up north, were gaining money, you know, using corrupt ways. You know, industry was really bad. It was really corrupt. That's why he cut the budget, cut much of the federal budget. He eliminated tax on whiskey, and he reduced the size of the army. Thomas Jefferson is also known for the Louisiana Purchase, 1803. Although I won't really be covering that much, but of the Louisiana Purchase, it was basically bought Napoleon, and it allowed for many settlers to expand, or many Americans to expand westward. Many of you might know, the Lewis and Clark expeditions, and with Lewis and Clark expeditions with Sacagawea, and other stuff where Lewis and Clark went on expedition, and they made relations with many native tribes, and they really gotten to know the land, and they were trying to find really good water passageways. In addition, we have kind of this, I guess, really important Supreme Court, or important Supreme Court ruling. Marbury versus Madison, led by John Marshall, who was a Chief Justice at the time, basically gave the Supreme Court the right to declare whether a law is unconstitutional. So I'm pretty sure every one of you know that the Supreme Court currently in the United States, its powers include whether to declare a law unconstitutional or constitutional. So this Marbury versus Madison, this ruling actually gave the Supreme Court what is called judicial review, and it gave them this power. And it also gave the Supreme Court, it also established the powers of the Supreme Court, because before, it was kind of very wishy-washy, and there wasn't really explicit rules or laws passed that talked about the power of the Supreme Court. But this ruling basically said the Supreme Court had power over both federal and state legislature, or both federal and state government. That's really important because, it shapes the way our Supreme Court is, it shapes the roles of our Supreme Court today. And also, Thomas Jefferson also had another important kind of policy, the embargo of 1807. He stopped all American exports from Europe. When obviously this is very unpopular with many New England shipbuilders, because they relied on exports to Europe for money and profit. Because, we talked about before, he didn't really like the New Englanders, and he thought that they were all corrupt and industrialist. So this was really, this affected it negatively on New Englanders, but it also increased manufacturing. So that's something that's, was positive coming out of the embargo of 1807. And so the thing was, after Thomas Jefferson, we have James Madison. Although, he was really important in the founding of the Constitution, and he did a lot with the Bill of Rights. He did a lot of writing with the Bill of Rights. I won't really be talking about him because I feel like much of his policies, could be simplified with the idea that he increased federal government, he increased the power of the federal government. But a really important thing was that he started the War of 1812, which basically kind of ruled over his presidency, the War of 1812. So I'm going to go on to that now. So the War of 1812 was a war that was caused by Britain's impressment of American soldiers. So impressment is basically when, let's say we can have two countries. So we have Britain and America. When a country forces soldiers of another country to go aboard their ship, their naval ship, and then just take them as either prisoners, or take them as soldiers, or just take them take their troops, or take their soldiers away from, I guess, their original ship. And America didn't really like that because, one, much of impressment caused a lot of conflict and caused a lot of seizing of ships, which is bad for profit. And two, they were impressing, American soldiers that were American, not Britain. So it's kind of seen as this kind of declaration of war. You're trying to harm our people. So the War of 1812 was pushed by the Warhawks. So the Warhawks were a group of people that were in Congress, that were part of the federal government. A really important person, his name is Henry Clay, and they pushed for war because they thought that what Britain was doing is obviously wrong, and it might start, it was another infringement on their individual rights. And they also hoped to drive Britain away from Canada. So that was another goal they wanted from the war. So in 1815, after a hard war, America won and defeated Britain because they were invading Louisiana. And the effects of the War of 1812, there were many, mainly four. It restored American pride, nationalism, and confidence. You know, Canada was now independent, and a British defeat meant that natives lost another ally to protect them from Americans who wanted to expand westward, because the relationship between Native Americans and much of like the Native Americans and like the American settlers, it was very strenuous, as in many Americans wanted to expand westward and many natives were obviously losing their land. There's a depletion in their population. We talked about the diseases that caused many natives to actually just like many native populations to just die out. So, you know, British defeat meant that, you know, Britain had to recover, and it meant that they lost an ally. And the Federalists who didn't support the war, or the Democratic Republicans who didn't support the war, the Federalists who didn't support the war and wanted a good relationship with Britain were now shamed at the Hartford Convention. So this served as another kind of end to the Federalist Party, because they were seen as, you know, unpatriotic and not supporting the war, not supporting America. So the Federalist Party became very readily unpopular, and the Democratic Republicans kind of like ruled during this era time. Okay, then after that we had Jame Monroe. Much of Jame Monroe presidency is, or like the name for it, it's called, or like what it's usually called is the era of good feeling, because, you know, right after the War of 1812, America felt really good about itself because it won another war with a, you know, British, or with a European naval power, world power, and there was a lot of nationalism, patriotism, you know, feeling proud to be American, feeling proud to have won the war. So he had what was called the American system. So American system, founded by Henry Clay, meant that, you know, he emphasized a national bank, high tariffs, and a really good federally supported infrastructure. So he wanted the federal government to, or he made the federal government pay for much of the infrastructure, you know, a lot of roads, a lot of other things like buildings, schools, just like a lot of things that would benefit like society and benefit much of the states. He also strengthened the federal government with his two kind of, I would say, these two Supreme Court rulings. Basically said, you know, it gave the federal government more power, and it allowed Congress to have the power over states. So again, we see this, you know, growing expansion of federal power, you know, this exchange of what were once like colonial America, a huge emphasis on like local state governments and representatives, now a much more stronger federal government to rule over like these states. And he's also very popular, or most known for the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, where he basically established U.S. primacy, or he gave where he basically established the United States role in the Western Hemisphere. So he said that European countries should not intervene in the Western Hemisphere, or else the U.S. will retaliate with their army or with their ships. Okay. So the Missouri Compromise was also really big kind of I would say like policy, or like a policy or a law, or like kind of like ruling during this time, especially since we have territories that were free, as in like African Americans were considered free, or Africans were considered free in certain areas, and other states or other territories that considered African Americans or Africans as slaves and used them for, you know, free manual labor. So the Missouri Compromise started when Missouri applied to be a slave state, and, you know, both the North and the South, especially in the federal government, wanted a balanced number of slave and free states, because a balanced number would mean and kind of like a more equal number of representatives in in Congress and in the federal government and in Congress and the Senate, right? So they wanted a balance, or the slave states or many southern states would able to have rulings of that benefited the South instead of the North. So because Missouri applied to be a slave state, Henry Clay again, he took part in this, and he basically had him and Maine. Basically, they both applied to be a free state. So this meant that there was a now equal number of free and slave states. There's a more balance. So that meant that there were more equal representatives for both the North and South. And the Missouri Compromise basically banned slavery from the Louisiana Territory, which was bought by Thomas Jefferson, north of the 36th degree and 30 parallel. So if you look at the picture, you see that line in red. So everything that's up in the north, or everything that's up top, would be considered free, with the exception of Missouri, and everything that was below the green would be a slave state. And obviously the yellow, Florida territory, that was still under Spanish rule, and that's unorganized territory that we have yet to obtain, or yet to kind of organize or name the states for. And obviously, the Missouri Compromise would foreshadow much of the sectionalism disputes over the North and South, foreshadowing the Civil War, since slavery was a really big factor of the Civil War. And after that presidency, after James Monroe, we had the presidency of John Quincy Adams. So John Quincy Adams' presidency, or the election of 1824, marked the end of the era of good feeling, because James Monroe was no longer president. So the election of 1824 was between two main figures: one, Andrew Jackson, and two, John Quincy Adams. Andrew Jackson won the popular vote because he was one of the generals that fought in the War of 1812. He was actually the one that actually defeated the British Army in Louisiana. So he was really, really popular. So he won the popular vote and the electoral vote. However, the vote actually went to the House of Representatives, because it was very, very close. And Henry Clay, who we talked about before, also nicknamed the Great Compromiser, was also running during this time, but he decided to drop out, and he decided to publicly support John Quincy Adams. So this caused, John Quincy Adams to win, because, Henry Clay was deemed as this really good moral person who really helps the United States during hard times, both in the War of 1812, both in the Missouri Compromise, and like other things. So John Quincy Adams won, and much of the people that supported Andrew Jackson, and Andrew Jackson himself, said that this was a corrupt bargain, because John Quincy Adams ended up giving Henry Clay the position of Secretary of State. So many people that supported Andrew Jackson was like, they thought that Henry Clay supported John Quincy Adams on purpose, and that he was going to and that he dropped out on purpose just so he can support John Quincy Adams, and just so John Quincy Adams can win. So because of this kind of like corrupt bargain scandal, although it's never like, we don't really know if it's true, John Quincy Adams had a disappointing presidency, because much of his laws and much of his proposals were voted down by those who supported Jackson. Although he did a lot, he did try to have a lot of educational initiatives and try to restore roads, and a lot of emphasis on like public education and public health measures. It was disappointing, as he didn't really do that much in his presidency. After John Quincy Adams, his presidency, Andrew Jackson, of course, won the election, because people were still supporting him, supportive of him during his time. They nicknamed him O Hickory, because he was very tough, and he kind of led the American army to victory in the War of 1812. War of 1812. So, almost like Jefferson, but kind of differently, he kind of emphasized what he called Jacksonian democracy. So this was this was an emphasis on the common man, and he said that he wanted to represent the interest of the common man, and he supported expanded suffrage. So much of the reason why Andrew Jackson actually won this presidency was because during this time, suffrage for white males or white Americans who were male didn't rely on you owning land. So you could now, so before you could only vote if you owned, land, but now you didn't have to own land to vote. So, because he supported, suffrage, many people decided to vote for him because they thought he was a president that would express, my grievances, and that would pass laws that would benefit me. So Andrew Jackson was also known for what was called the spoil system. So the spoil system, kind of like the corrupt bargain in a way, where people who supported him in his election for president, he gave them positions of power in the federal government. So people like his political partners were given power, and oftentimes they were obviously unqualified. So this was kind of like this corrupt, you would say, like this kind of corrupt bargain as well. However, this spoil system was actually true. Like, we're not sure, the corrupt bargain was actually kind of like the saying of John Quincy Adams arising to be president. So he also, because Andrew Jackson supported the interests of the common man, he also opposed privileged elites and the national bank. In July 1832, Jackson actually vetoed the recharter of the bank, and he said no to the national bank, and this caused the rise of what is called pet banks, and pet banks, which banks that are like much smaller within each state or in each local kind of like community or territory. This was really bad because there was no like one national currency. So United States was basically flooded with paper currency. It was very chaotic, and it wasn't efficient at all, and there was actually too much money being printed out. So actually there was like a loss in the value of money. So that was, obviously something that's bad. The vetoing of the charter of the bank also brought the rise to a two-party system. So Andrew Jackson kind of dropped the Republican and Democratic Republican and started calling his party the Democrat or the Democratic Party. And the other party, while we see like the Federalist Party, almost dying out, there was a rise of the Whig Party, which shared some of the same ideals. So Whig as in W-H-I-G, Whig Party, which shared ideals. The Whigs were former Federalists that supported national bank, and they supported much of like what we talked about, the Federalist ideals. And he's also really known for the removal of Native Americans, or the Indian Removal Act. During this time, he kind of started this movement to move Native Americans to the west of the Mississippi, to where they lived on reservations. And the most kind of like people know him by the most is the Trail of Tears. However, he didn't really he was not president during the Trail of Tears. The Marvin Van Buren, his vice president during this time, actually became president, and he initiated the Trail of Tears. Andrew Jackson was actually just the president who started like this movement of Native Americans, or this movement of removing Native Americans from their land. So, and here's a very famous picture of a artist depicting the Trail of Tears and depicting the movement of Native American tribes, specifically like the Cherokee tribe, out of their land to reservations. So then we're going to talk about the antebellum South, or many call it the Old South. So the antebellum South is basically the conditions of the South pre-Civil War. So we have this idea of King Cotton, or the Cotton Kingdom, because in 1793, the invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney allowed slaves to sock more cotton, to actually produce more cotton. So the the supplies for cotton increased, as well as the demand. So cotton became a very big source of profit. That's why the South called Cotton King. Became, the southern states became something called like states of King Cotton. And because much of the South, so around Virginia and Maryland, because much of the soil became, less fertile due to all like the tobacco growing and all the plantations from, during the time of the Chesapeake colonies, many actually moved to the Black Belt region, so around Georgia to Louisiana. So many moved to this red area we see here. And so that's new fertile land to grow more cotton, thanks to the cotton gin. So we also have some revolutionary changes that do happen in antebellum South. First, we have changes in transportation. In 1811, there was a construction of a national road. The Erie Canal opened in 1825. So we see this picture right here. It's the Erie Canal. It goes across New York, and its canal then goes, attaches itself right to the Great Lakes. So this was really important because it was really good in transferring supplies, just communication in general, and just really shortened the time of when supplies or materials could be transported, made everything more efficient. We also have the invention of steamboats, the construction of railroads. These all shortened the time of travel and made everything more efficient, and made the states more, or the United States, more industrialized, and really brought, more people as well, that were from the East Coast to the West, and more settlement to the West as well. We also have some changes in agriculture. We talked about before, the Eli Whitney and the cotton gin. We do have what is called the mechanical reaper and the steel plow, Mechanical Reaper by Cypress McCormick. It basically shortened the time which wheat could be harvested, and or which crops, could be used directly. And the steel plow helped with farming, because Midwestern soil, so much of the soil in the Midwest was really tough and sticky, so it was really hard to actually, dig or use your shovel to dig down and get the soil out and plant more seeds. So the steel plow actually, because it's made of steel, it was much stronger than much of the materials like wood or that was used for plows before. We also have changes in communication. Changes in communication is directly tied to changes in transportation. So we have, we talk about the canals, railroads, and steamboats. But in 1844, Samuel Morse also made the first telegraph message. And on your right, you see the telegraph, or like the telegraph machine, and this directly shortened the time of communication. People could connect with each other. It made the United States, or made the states, much more connected. It made transportation much more easier and communication much more easier, which is really key considering, our developments in technology today compared to, I guess, back then. So much of the society in the antebellum South could be, characterized by, slavery and relationship between slaves and, plantation owners, or like the whites in the South. So 4% actually of the, white class actually owned more than half the slaves and harvested much of the cotton and tobacco. If we look at the graphs here, we see that, you see that slaveholders with more than 100 plus slaves were actually 0.1%, and many white Americans or many white Southerners actually didn't really own that many slaves. It was just a large, I guess, like a small minority, or a minority of Southerners that actually owned that, like the majority of slaves. So we have also around a 25 to 40% rate of whites who were unskilled and who really owned no slaves or had no land. So again, this feeds into the idea, many people think that everybody in the South owned slaves during the Antebellum South or pre-Civil War, but that's not true. It was only a minority or a small group of people that did. But many, regular farmers or many, unskilled whites or whites that were impoverished supported slavery because it made them feel superior. Because, many weren't living that like great life where they had a plantation, where they had numerous amount of lands. Many actually owned little to no land. So they felt that, the establishment of slavery, or having African Americans or Africans as slaves were good because it made them feel more superior, and it made them feel like, I guess, had a higher self-esteem in themselves. Like they had a higher self-esteem. It was just this mentality that was like enforced through like decades of using slaves for agriculture and using slaves for the demand from many European countries in the north. So we also have, we're also going to be focusing on kind of like slavery itself and the lives of African Americans and Africans. So in 1808, although Congress outlawed the African slave trade, there was a domestic slave trade because, we talked about this before, Virginia, Maryland owned around 56% of all enslaved Africans. But since much of the land was depleted and there wasn't really any more fertile soil, in 1800s to 1860s, slaves were sold to the Deep South. So we talked about the Black Belt region, and so they were sold to the Black Belt region and also the deeper South between Georgia and much of like the southern Texas area. So we see, although Congress outlawed this international African slave trade, there were still a lot of slaves that were being used for labor, especially for cotton, since cotton demand was growing. We look on the right here, we see the growth of key slave cities. Slavery was still growing as the demand for agricultural products was still growing, but it was the change in like which states were using them or which states were using them the most, or using slaves the most for like their food or profit. So within many slave, I guess, plantations, or like many plantations, resistance was very infrequent because it was really hard since they didn't know the land around them. Many didn't really speak English. Many couldn't read. Because of all the slave laws and the codes that said slaves couldn't have any of these like rights, or couldn't have the right to read or join their families. But much of the resistance that slaves did do, they like it was like smaller instances of resistance, like maybe something like breaking the tools, so they didn't have to work that day, or smaller things, or smaller instances in which slave resisted their owners. Many families, like many African families, many African American families were actually separated because they were sold to different plantations that don't sold to different owners. However, slaves created strong kinships with one another despite not having actually blood relations. So within these kinships, there was an emphasis on religion, on culture, on the culture they had back in Africa, and using songs to express their feelings of, instances of resentment, grief, just sadness. And it was like those two things were really, really important within many like slave kinships. In 1860, although there were a lot of African Americans who were slaves, a lot of Africans who were slaves, there were actually around 250,000 free African Americans. But again, they really didn't have any individual rights, and they had menial jobs. So menial meaning that the jobs weren't really important. They would be like just like insignificant jobs that didn't pay much. We also have during this time, moving on to, despite an emphasis on agriculture in the South, we also have changes in commerce and industry. We have a rise of the factory system. We have a rise in the factory system. So specifically the Lowell Mills. Lowell Mills hired unmarried women from New England. So New England, I meant like the northern kind of states we talked about in the beginning, colonial America. And he basically built this kind of like model town where there was a church, there were houses, there were their workplaces, and there were like their recreational spaces. It's where women lived and they worked at the same time. So it was very convenient. They also, but then by 1834 to 1836, their wages were cut due to, they wanted an increase in profit and an increase in efficiency. So many women actually went on strike, but the use of strike breakers, which were people hired when people, go on strike, strike breakers were hired, which meant that many women actually lost their jobs, and the strikes were, they weren't helpful, and as they didn't change the conditions in these like Lowell mill systems. So we also have like the rise of a factory system, not only Lowell mills, but industrialization and technological changes. We talked about revolutionary changes in transportation, communication. There's also a growth of urban cities as well. The War of 1812 actually increased production in America, so that was really, really helpful to have these changes in commerce and industry. We also have during this time changes in immigration. So a lot of Irish and German immigrants actually immigrated during this time. Irish immigrants because of the potato famine in 1845. They settled in the Northeast and Lowell Mills. They worked in much of the Lowell Mills when the women were on strike. When women were on strike. For German immigrants, much of the reasons why they immigrated to America was because of political instability and economic unrest. They settled in the Midwest and rural area, and they had a diverse religion and culture. So many Germans were actually Protestants, Jews, and Catholics. When you compare it to Irish immigrants, who most were Catholics. However, despite them coming into America, there was actually an increase in anti-immigration sentiments. The establishment of the Know Nothing Party, or they call themselves sometimes like the American Party, the increased violence, it increased these xenophobic and very like racist sentiments towards these immigrants. So we see on the right, we actually see a political cartoon of, picturing Irish immigrants and German immigrants as very rowdy, as like always drinking, carrying the ballot box, as in like they're like flooding the ballot box with whoever they want, and like they're just skewing, the representatives in the federal government, just like bad depictions of Irish and German immigrants, mostly because many Irish immigrants and German immigrants also they were known for their establishment of or alcohol, I guess, factories or stores. So this is like a bad depiction of them, and there was a lot of violence and just a lot of racist things that were spewed out against them. So another thing about the Know Nothing Party, they kind of this was kind of like their flag, or like their motto. It says Native Americans beware of foreign influence. So the ironic part of this is that it wasn't Native Americans weren't talking about the actual, like the Indians that Columbus talked about, or that that were already here in the United States, but we're actually talking about, you know, the colonial Americans or the colonists. So they were actually considered Native Americans. And foreign influence obviously meant German and Irish immigrants. So that was basically our lesson. We kind of learned about, you know, the 1800s and like the rise of revolutionary changes, and also the antebellum himself, and also the establishment of increased federal power. And these two are the kind of like, let's say, like the pictures of the memes that like really expressed during this time. We have one, you know, Andrew Jackson killing the National Bank, but also ending up on a $20 bill, which is very ironic. And we have two, the importance of Eli Whitney's cotton gin in preserving and expanding American slavery. If anyone has any questions, I can answer them. Let's see. Can we learn about the World Wars and World War I and II? That will be in period 6 and 7. So we're in period 4 now. Next week we're gonna do period 4. We're gonna finish period 4. We're going on to period 5, and then so maybe like in a couple of weeks we'll learn about World War I and World War II. How did John Adams die? I'm not really sure how John Adams died. I guess we can do more research on that. Class ends at 5. If anyone has any questions, you can ask. I'm not really sure how John Adams died. Someone asked, can you explain the memes? Yes. So for the one on the left, we see that's Andrew Jackson, and we talked about how Andrew Jackson vetoed the charter, the charter for the National Bank. How he didn't like National Bank because he felt like, you know, it was where a lot of these Northerners or industrialists were corrupt, and they were like ruining, you know, American society. So he kills the National Bank, but he actually ends up on a $20 bill. It's kind of just like very ironic. I guess it's like ironic. And the one on the right, it talks about the preserving of American slavery. We see like American slavery like right here. It's being protected by Eli Whitney's cotton gin, because Eli Whitney's cotton gin, we talked about, expanded slavery and allowed for an increased demand of cotton and increased demand for slaves in the Black Belt region and the deeper South region. And natural death just means like the death to slavery, or like ending slavery, which obviously didn't happen because of cotton gin. Why memes? I think they're like short. I guess they're short. They're short, and they're like very concise to like describe a historical event. And I think some are like, I don't know, like some are funny and they're ironic, and it's kind of like you can like maybe like not laugh, but like a chuckle about them. And also I really like the pictures and depictions. I think they're like very correct, and they're like very representative of, you know, what happened during that time. Does anyone have any more questions? Aiden? You have your hand raised. Okay.
Didn't they remove Andrew Jackson from the $20 bill for that and a couple of other reasons?
Yeah, so we talked about before how like Andrew Jackson, you know, he kind of started this Indian removal movement, especially in 1830. He passed the Indian Removal Act. Basically, really didn't want much of the Cherokee tribes there in that area, and like started reservations. So yeah, I think there is talks about him like being like not ending up on the $20 bill anymore, but there's still, you know, prints of him on the $20 bill. If you want to find more like information or like research on that, that would be really great. If you can post on the Google Classroom. Sophie? Sophie?
And like, can you like do that?
You muted yourself. Okay, I'm gonna move on. You can always ask Hannah. You have a question?
Also, can you like post like, for example, you on the last class?
Sorry, I couldn't
posted
hear
a
you.
bunch
Cut
of
off.
things that we could watch. So like, I want you to like do like, for example, last class you posted a lot of videos to sum up the lesson. Can you do that?
Yeah, I'll do that as well. Yeah. Yeah, I can. Yep. Hannah, you have a question? Someone asked, why did Andrew Jackson get on a $20 bill and how? I'm not actually sure. Maybe because they thought he was a really good president. I'm not really sure. I mean, he did a lot of stuff that were like, based on his like, racist behavior. Of course, like during that time, there were obviously many people who were like racist against like minority groups, like Native Americans, African Americans, Jewish, and German immigrants. Why did they say they would put Harriet Tubman on it? There are talks to put Harriet Tubman on a $20 bill. I'm not really sure, maybe because, she was a really good activist for African American rights or just African rights in general. Can you post another quiz for us like next week? Yeah, I can post another homework or quiz if you want. Of course, it'll be due until next week. If anyone doesn't have any more questions, you can leave. If you do, you can type them in the chat.